Hey everyone, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Sorry about the technical difficulties we've been experiencing in the last two shows. I think we got it resolved. StreamYard should be back. Let me know if everything is working okay, if y'all hear me well, and if everything shows up on the screen well. Let's go ahead and talk about starting over. Let's talk about the question of Psalm 82 and how different people interpret it. We're going to look at it from just a strict monotheistic interpretation and perspective, which I think is probably the most common way in which it's read. We're also going to take a look at it from the perspective of the ancient Near Eastern cultures and how perhaps a polytheist would have read Psalm 82 in light of ancient Near Eastern culture and context. And we're going to take a look at Mark Smith, who is a Catholic author who has written on this question and the subject of Psalm 82 and how some people understood it in light of, again, ancient Near Eastern culture. We're going to first start out by taking a look at a Ugaritic text called the Baal Cycle. This is a text from Ugarit, a city in northern Syria, and this is a Canaanite text, and it was written roughly in 1500 BC. So before Moses and before anything was written in the Bible, this text was written. We're going to take a look at it and see what the Canaanite understanding of divinity was like, because some will see this as informing and contextualizing Psalm 82. Again, so this text written 1500 BC. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to take a look at it together, and then we'll see how it connects to our conversation about Psalm 82. So the Baal cycle is a Ugaritic text, 1500 BC, about the Canaanite god Baal or Baal, which means owner or Lord. So it can mean just in general Lord, or it can mean a specific name for a specific god, Baal. And this is actually why sometimes Yahweh calls himself Baal in the Old Testament, because it can just be loosely translated as Lord. But it could also be the name of a specific god. And in this case, in Canaanite culture, Baal was a storm god associated with fertility. Storm gods were very common at this time, as you can imagine. And in fact, in some cases, Yahweh in the Old Testament is depicted as a storm god, a desert storm deity coming out of the land of Edom. So out of what's now northern Saudi Arabia. And so Yahweh is depicted in different ways, but there is language and depictions of him as a storm god coming from that location. Now, what happens here is, as we're going to see in this text, is in Canaanite mythology, as with many others, Babylonians, Sumerians, Egyptians, all of these civilizations and cultures in the ancient Near Eastern part of the world had a concept of what's called the divine council or divine assembly. It's a council of gods. They meet in heaven and they have conversations, and sometimes they fight against each other, and one ups another god, and then he becomes the head of the whole divine council. He becomes the head of the gods. And so you'll see this concept of a divine assembly, a pantheon, and a collection of gods where they come together and assemble together for one purpose or another. All of these ancient Near Eastern civilizations have that. And the Bible has that too. The Bible actually notes the divine council, the divine assembly. We're going to see how. But in this Ugaritic text, this Canaanite text, the divine assembly is brought up, and Baal is fighting against other gods so that he can be made supreme. He wants to be number one. Right now, he's just this regular storm god, but he wants to beat up the other gods and become victorious. And in the story, he beats up the other gods, and he ends up becoming like the main god for just a little bit of time. And then, but it's not like long-standing kind of a thing. He barely, by the skin of his teeth, gets in there, leads the pack, and then it's just for a temporary period of time. Normally, El is seen as the God who is over the other gods and over the divine council. El. That's going to be important for Psalm 82, so keep that in mind. El is normally depicted as this ageless, beardless, ancient, and wise figure. And in some ways, you could actually see that as a depiction of God in Daniel, the book of Daniel. Well, El is often depicted as that way, this grandfatherly, white beard, long beard deity who is over the other gods. Sometimes he's also depicted as a bull. There's various depictions of him. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at it because it will function as a backdrop for our conversation with Psalm 82. So take a look at it here. Let's see. Let's scroll down a little bit. Depart, ye lads, don't tarry. There now be off on your way towards the assembled body. So there's this divine council, this council of gods that meets in heaven. It's a divine assembly. So when you see assembled body, that's what they're talking about. In the midst of Mount Lala, at the feet of El, fall not down. See, again, here El is referenced. He is the head of the pantheon and the head of the divine council. He's the God of the gods. He's the King of kings. He's the one who is over this divine assembly. But again, Baal is trying to get on top right now. Prostrate not to the assembled body, proudly standing, say ye your speech, and say unto Baal, say unto bull, my father El. See how El is depicted as a bull here? Declare unto the assembled body, message of Yam your Lord. Yam is the god of the ocean, and that is who Baal is fighting against in the first text. He's beating up Yam. Then he's going to beat up Mot, who is the god of the dead. Of your master Judge Nahar, surrender the God with the following: him whom the multitudes worship, give Baal to me to lord over, Dagon's son, whose spoil I'll possess. Now, Baal here is depicted as Dagon's son. Now, you probably remember Dagon from the Bible. Dagon is mentioned as an idol, a statue in certain biblical texts, and then the Ark of the Covenant is placed before it, and then turns out they come back and the statue's been destroyed. And the idea is that the presence of Yahweh overcame this statue of Baal, so Yahweh has overcome Baal, and therefore his statue couldn't stand in his presence. So that's who Dagon is, and Dagon's son is Baal, who's also mentioned in the Bible multiple times. And notice that they're fighting, right? Baal is fighting against Yam and Mot, and this is a very common theme where the gods in the divine council are fighting against each other and trying to one-up each other and overcome each other. That's going to be important for our text in Psalm 82. The lads depart, they delay not, there they are off on their way to the midst of Mount Lala towards the assembled body. Now the gods were sitting to eat, the holy ones to dine. Holy ones is a reference to divinities, to gods. Baal attending upon El. So here you see there's a distinction between Baal and El. They're not the same God. Okay, so there's a whole lot more to this, but I just wanted to give you a little feel for it, and so that you can see a few themes. There's a divine council, a divine assembly of gods. There's some who are trying to fight others to get on top. El currently is the main leader, however. Those are the big takeaways that I want you to have right now as we now transition to Psalm 82. And once more, I'll then go over Mark Smith, Catholic scholar, who's going to give some commentary on this very passage. Okay, Psalm 82. Now, if you read this just in English, you're likely going to miss all of this. So we're going to have to take a look at the Hebrew. And even if you just read the Hebrew, but you don't know anything about ancient Near Eastern culture, you'll probably miss all of this as well. So you have to know just some very basics, at least, of Hebrew, and also just the very basics of ancient Near Eastern culture to really get a full feel for what might be going on here. Okay, at least according to some, at least according to how some would interpret this. I'll show you how. Two different conclusions can be arrived at from the same data. Two different groups can look at this information and interpret it very differently. And they're looking at the same data, and I'll show you why. Okay, so watch what it says here in the English. Share my screen. You should be able to see it right around. Well, I don't think it's working. I guess we're still having tech issues, huh? Boy, I just can't win, huh? This might be my third attempt to do the stream. Having a lot of issues here with StreamYard, Riverside. Good to see you, Vast, in the okay. For some reason it kicked me out. I'm back. Let's see if I can get it going here. Okay. All right. We're back in business. I was gonna say we've already made like 3 attempts to try to do this show. We've had a lot of stream difficulties today. Okay. All right. Y'all should be able to see me now. Let me know in the chat if everything's good, and we'll go ahead and proceed. And by the way, I'm going to have a sip of my sparkling ice here. Quench my thirst. Lest someone thinks that I'm drinking on the air. No, it's sparkling ice, which is it's like carbonated sugar-free water. That's basically what it is. All right, can y'all hear me and see me? Please let me know in the chat if I'm coming through, if everything's good. I need to get some feedback from y'all before I proceed, however, so waiting in the chat for y'all to respond. Can y'all still hear me and see me? Are we good? Should I proceed? Okay, all good. Good deal. All right, let's go ahead and move forward. Now, if you're just looking at the English, what you're going to see here is God has taken his place in the divine council. Now, so right there already in the English, you are seeing there is a divine council. There's God in this divine council, this divine assembly. And so you might wonder, what is that divine council? Well, there's going to be different interpretations, and that's what we're exploring today. But let's actually take a deeper look beyond just the English. It says Elohim has taken his place in the council of El. Now, Elohim here in that word, you can hear El, the god El, and Him, the Yud and Mim is going to be that's going to be the plural. So Im is usually a depiction of the plural in Hebrew. So Elohim is gods. Here it's translated as God, but it could be translated as gods because it is a plural noun. Now, El, which you can hear in Elohim, can mean two things. It could just mean generically God, like just God as a generic conception. Or it could mean specifically the god El, the god who is the Canaanite god, the god El, who is over this divine council. So Elohim has taken his place in the council of El. Now that's important because the council of El is usually depicted in Canaanite theology as, again, El is at the top, and then these other gods, these other divine beings in the council are the children of El. They're the sons of El. They're the Benai El, or Benai Elohim, as some biblical texts put it. They're the children of El. So you see how when you're looking at the Hebrew, we're picking up on some nuances we don't see in the English. In the English, it just says God has taken his place in the divine council. But when you're looking in the Hebrew, there's a little bit more that might be going on. It's saying Elohim, gods, or you could translate it as one God, has taken his place in the council of El. The council of El. The council of the god El, who is the father of all these other gods in this council, in this assembly. You see how there's a little bit more going on in the Hebrew, possibly at least, that you might not pick up on if you're looking at just the English. Okay, so he is accusing these other people in the divine council. How long will you judge unjustly? Give justice to the weak and the fatherless, rescue the weak and the needy. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. Skipping down to verse 6, watch what happens. So God, Elohim, is saying to these other figures in this divine council, the Council of El, he's saying to them, I say you are gods. And here he's saying, I say you are Elohim. He calls them gods. He says, you and the divine council, all you other people here, y'all are Elohim. Y'all are gods. Sons of the Most High, all of you. Now, you don't really pick up on what's going on in the Hebrew if you just look at the English. Sons of the Most High. But actually, in the Hebrew, it's saying sons of Elyon. Elyon. Hear El in there again? Elyon is a name for the Canaanite god El. It could be translated just generically as Most High, El Elyon, or it could be translated as the god El, Elyon. So he's saying, you are sons of El. You're all sons of El. I say you're gods, Elohim, you're children of El. And then he tells them, nevertheless, you shall die like men. Now, he doesn't say that they are men. He says, you'll die like men. You're gods, but you're going to die like men and fall like any prince. And so you remember how I was pointing out previously in Canaanite mythology, as in other ancient Near Eastern mythology, in this divine assembly where you got these gods, they're usually fighting against each other. They're contending against each other. It's one of them trying to overcome the other. And so what's going on here is, in the same way that Baal was trying to overcome the other Elohim, the other children of El in the divine assembly, in that Ugaritic text that we took a look at, here Yahweh, he's not mentioned as Yahweh specifically, but it's clear it's Yahweh speaking in the divine assembly. Yahweh is telling the children of El, these gods, he's going to overcome them. He acknowledges that they're gods, but he says, I'm going to overcome all of you, and you're going to die like men. So in other words, he's going to be victorious over the divine council, the divine assembly. He's going to defeat all of these other Elohim. And then watch what happens. Once he does that, it says, arise, O God, arise, Elohim. This is in reference to Yahweh. Arise and judge the earth, for to you belongs all the nations. Now, do you know why that's important? Here it says, to you belongs, or you inherit all the nations. Why is that important? Well, in at least Canaanite conception of divinity, what goes on with the divine council, the divine assembly, is one God is over some territory. You know, this other God, he's over that other territory. This God, he's over that territory. They're all over a different territory. And the one who's at the top is trying to overcome the other ones so that he can be supreme. And if he is victorious, he inherits all the territory. He's over all of it. He's not over just one region of the earth. He's over the whole thing. And so what you have going on here, at least according to some, the way some are going to read it, as I'm going to show you with Mark Smith, they're reading this as Yahweh is sitting in the midst of a divine council with other gods. He beats up the other gods, and he inherits all of the nations. He's no longer just the God of the land of Israel, the territory of Israel. He becomes the inheritor of all the lands because he's overcome all these other gods who were over these other lands. And some will then, as Mark Smith is about to do, connect the dots with Deuteronomy 32, where it appears that in the Hebrew text, some read it as El, the god El, is dividing up the land and the territory and the earth to different gods, to different Elohim, and to Yahweh. Yahweh inherits Israel. But here by Psalm 82, according to this methodology and interpretation, by this time, he's no longer over just Israel. He beat up the other gods in the divine council, and now he's over all the nations. And so this would be how at least a polytheist would probably read Psalm 82. Now, we will take a look here in a moment of a strict monotheistic interpretation of the very same text. But let's take a look quickly here at what Mark Smith has said about this passage that, kind of ties all this together a little bit better than I've probably done. So Mark Smith, he is a Catholic, and he writes in his book on the origins of biblical monotheism, especially in the light of Ugaritic texts, Canaanite texts. He gives the backdrop for the origins of biblical monotheism. And he's talking about the Baal cycle and all of the things I just went over with you. Okay, so he says, one biblical text that presents Yahweh in an explicit divine council scene does not cast him as its head, who is left decidedly mute, or describe probably the reason why it survived the later collapsing of different tiers. The text is Psalm 82, which begins at verse 1. So here he's saying Psalm 82 doesn't depict Yahweh as the head of the divine council, at least not yet. He only becomes the head when he beats up the other Elohim, later on in verse 8. So God, Elohim, stands in the divine assembly, or the assembly of El. Among the divinities, or the Elohim, he pronounces judgment. So he says, here the figure of God understood as Yahweh takes a stand in the assembly. The name El was understood in the tradition, and perhaps at the time of the text's original composition as well, to be none other than Yahweh, and not a separate God called El. So there's some debate on, is El at this time conceived of as distinct from Yahweh, or is he going to be seen as the same as Yahweh when Psalm 82 is written? Now, he's theorizing that Yahweh and El are conceived of as the same divinity here. In any case, the assembly consists of all the gods of the world, for all these other gods are condemned to death in verse 6. I myself presumed that you are gods, sons of the Most High Elyon, yet like humans you will die and fall like any prince. So he says, a prophetic voice emerges in verse 8, calling for God, now Elohim, to assume the role of judge of all the earth. Arise, O God, judge the world, for you inherit all the nations. And inheriting the nations would imply that he didn't previously possess the nations. Here, Yahweh, in effect, is asked to assume the job of all the gods to rule their nations in addition to Israel. So previously, he was just over Israel. Now, been bumped up to over all the territories because he beat up all the other gods. Verse 6 addresses the gods as the sons of Elyon, probably a title of El at an early point in biblical tradition. El Elyon mentioned 3 times in Genesis 14, 18 through 20. If this supposition is correct, Psalm 82 preserves a tradition that casts the God of Israel in the role not of the presiding God of the pantheon, but as one of his sons. So he's saying the way it seems to read, it looks like Yahweh is one of the sons of the head of the divine council, but he beats up the other gods and therefore becomes over the whole thing. Each of these sons has a different nation as his ancient patrimony or family inheritance, and therefore serves as its ruler. Yet verse 6 calls on Yahweh to arrogate to himself the traditional inheritance of all the other gods, thereby making Israel and all the world the inheritance of Israel's God. The family view of the divine arrangement of the world appears also in the versions of Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9, preserved in the Septuagint and the Dead Sea Scrolls. We actually looked at this specifically in another text because I pulled up the Dead Sea Scrolls for you. I showed you the actual fragment and showed you where it talks about the Benai Elohim, the sons of El, the sons of Elohim. And I showed you how one scribe was attempting to change the text because he was uncomfortable with perhaps polytheistic conclusions that he was coming to from the text. So the scribe altered the text, and that alteration made its way into other versions like the Latin Vulgate and even translations of the Vulgate like the Douay-Rheims. So some of those translations have that scribal alteration because the scribe seems to be uncomfortable with what he concluded as polytheistic um, tones in the text. So he tried to alter that and change divine sons, the sons of Elohim, to sons of Israel, which doesn't make any sense contextually. And we showed that from the oldest manuscripts, that wasn't the original reading, and therefore this was a scribal alteration. Okay, so Deuteronomy 32, 8 through 9, just to recap that, says, when the Most High Elyon allotted peoples for inheritance, when he divided up humanity, so when he's dividing up the earth, he fixed the boundaries for peoples according to the numbers of the divine sons, or the sons of Elohim. So the idea here is that, El is dividing up the earth according to the different children that he has, his own children in this divine council. So you got this God over here, he gets that territory. This God over here, he gets that. This God over here, he gets that. Now for Yahweh, Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob his own inheritance. So Yahweh gets Israel, according to Deuteronomy 32. So El is dividing up the land, and he assigns to Yahweh Israel. Now that's what he's talking about here. Now, of course, a strict monotheistic interpretation would rather see Elyon as Yahweh, as the same person, and would not recognize that there are other gods. And so divine sons would likely be interpreted either as the people of Israel or as angels. Sometimes they might be referred to as divine sons, and so might this be a reference to angels. So a strict monotheistic interpretation would just see this as, God is dividing up the territory and assigning different places to different angels, but Yahweh, God keeps one portion, he reserves one portion for himself, and that is Israel. That's how a strict monotheistic interpretation would go of this text. But you could see how an ancient Near Eastern, or maybe more of a polytheistic interpretation, would take place here with the very same text. So this is why I say different people can read the exact same information and come to two different conclusions. And mostly it's because of each one of their assumptions. But so the same thing can actually go on here with what we're looking at in the Psalm 82 context. But he does say the traditional Hebrew text perhaps reflects a discomfort with this polytheistic theology of Israel, for it shows not divine sons, as in the Greek and Dead Sea Scrolls, but sons of Israel. And Emmanuel Tov, who's the preeminent scholar in this field, labels the Masoretic text here an anti-polytheistic alteration. The text of the Septuagint Dead Sea Scrolls shows Israelite polytheism, which that focuses on the central importance of Yahweh of Israel within the larger scheme of the world. Yet this larger scheme provides a place for the other gods of the other nations of the world. And so the scribe had some discomfort with that and altered the text. Okay. So let's go back to Psalm 82 and maybe look at this from a strict monotheistic interpretation. Because obviously from, monotheistic interpretation, there are no other gods. There is no such thing. And El is not some distinct being from Yahweh. El is Yahweh. There's no difference here. Elohim is just in reference to one God. There's no multiple gods. And maybe what looks like references to other gods is just references to angels. So let's read through this with a strict monotheistic interpretation. So Elohim has taken his place in the divine council, or the council of El. So, the strict monotheistic interpretation is going to be, Elohim takes his place in a council of his own, his own council, the council of El. Elohim is El in this paradigm. And so what is this council? It's likely going to be a council of God and the angels. The angels. Okay. So number two, how long will you judge unjustly? I don't know. I guess these Angels could be judging unjustly. There is another interpretation, by the way. I'll give that one here in a second. Give justice to the weak and the fatherless, rescue the weak and the needy. They have neither knowledge nor understanding. Well, what is the other interpretation here? If this is not angels, what is this divine counsel? If it's not gods, if it's not angels, because they're judging unjustly, then what would it be? Some haven't interpreted this as these are rulers on the earth, earthly judges, like human judges, and they're judging unjustly. But because they are rulers, he is, they are depicted as gods insofar as they have like an earthly authority to judge people. They're depicted as gods. And so they're seen as this divine council. I don't know how that interpretation works with a divine council, because divine council is something that takes place in heaven. Obviously, earthly judges are on earth, right? So there might be some difficulties with the human judge theory, but there is that one, and then they have neither knowledge nor understanding. And he says, I say you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. So I say you're Elohim, but he says, nevertheless, you'll die like men and you'll fall like any prince. And so some might understand this as these are, again, human judges that are being unjust. And so they're called gods insofar as they represent divine authority in their judgment. So they're loosely called gods, but not, like, strictly speaking, actual gods. And they're going to die like men because of their unjust judgment. And after that, it's just saying, arise, O God, judge the earth, for you inherit all the nations. God is inheriting all of the land, just not insofar as he wasn't the one who possesses it before, but maybe this just expresses that he is the possessor of all things, and this is just an ancient Near Eastern flavor way of doing it. So again, this could be interpreted with like a strict monotheistic paradigm. It could also be interpreted within that larger polytheistic Canaanite paradigm, right? So that's why I think that you have some scholars, some of which are strict monotheists, others who are maybe not even believers at all, that maybe they're even atheists, and sometimes they'll maybe see it in a strict monotheistic way, or they'll interpret this as evidence that the psalmist here is borrowing from conceptions of divinities from Canaanite mythology. So like he's importing some of that Canaanite mythology here. And I think those scholars would then argue that later on biblical texts kind of get rid of this language, some of this older language that you have in Psalm 82, and they get rid of that, and then they affirm like a strict monotheism. So some of this divine assembly talk and stuff like that, all that disappears later on, and then there's just an emphasis on strict monotheism. So that's how some of those scholars are going to see this. But oddly enough, you got Mark Smith, who is a Catholic, who sees this as a polytheistic text. He does see this as polytheistic or henotheistic, which would be, henotheism is the idea that there are other gods, but one God is over this territory. So in your particular territory, you just worship the one God who's over your territory, but you recognize that there are other gods elsewhere, but you only worship that one God. Just pure polytheism says just worship whoever you want, as many gods as you want, regardless of where you are. But yeah, Mark Smith, who's a Catholic, does take the opinion that this is evidence of polytheism and henotheism in the biblical text, because he's going to assert that it seems the biblical author here, the Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32, was importing Canaanite mythology into the text, and then later on this talk ends up kind of going away, and the biblical authors end up adopting a strict monotheistic interpretation. And so going back over this, people will tend to read it in light of those later passages that are very clearly strictly monotheistic and do not recognize that there's a divine council and doesn't talk about such a thing, and doesn't recognize that there are other gods or other Elohim. But this is this is what's fascinating me. This is why you can have different groups who come to very different interpretations, and they're looking at the same data. It's because they're coming with different presuppositions. If you come with a presupposition that the biblical authors were strict monotheists, you're going to arrive at that conclusion. If you come with the assumption that the biblical authors were fallible and were importing Canaanite mythology, you're going to come away with that interpretation. Let's see, what do we have in the chat? Happy to look at your comments here. Michael talks about the past of ancient serpent. What? Can we try to keep it on topic here? What else do we have? Okay, SBM says divine sons, high rank of spirit beings, sons of God, not the unique son of God. I'm sorry, y'all. I don't know if I'm just failing to understand y'all, or if some of y'all need to work on your English. Okay. Let's say Vast. Good to see you. How are you? Hope you're having a good day. Yeah, thank you. It's been wild with all the tech difficulties, but persevering, hanging in there. Hope that y'all are hanging in there with me. Yeah, so earlier y'all saw the blue screen of death when I cut out there. I'm telling you, man, it's wild. It's rough. I don't know what's going on. Okay, so I don't see. Okay, I do see Jimmy. Good to see you. Learning stuff. Welcome. Yeah, good. So I hope that y'all are, and going to be going through a lot more videos talking about these things. So I hope y'all are appreciating them, because I find this incredibly fascinating. It's a really interesting rabbit hole to go down to see some of this stuff. So I figured while I go down that rabbit hole, y'all can go down that one with me as well. Okay, Great Wall. Is there a lot of debate about this passage from my Christian perspective? Like you said, it's clear that God is speaking with the angels. Okay, so yeah, there is a lot of debates, but I think that's due to presuppositions. Again, I think if you're coming to this conversation with a strict monotheistic paradigm and the perspective that the biblical authors make no mistakes, and that the biblical authors also possess a strict monotheistic paradigm, then you're going to read it like that. You'll read this divine council as something other than God's. The problem with the angels theory here is, as I've shown in this video, he's talking about these people in the divine council judging unjustly. That doesn't sound like his angels. That sounds, in fact, like other gods, right? But some have interpreted this as neither, not other gods and not angels, but as earthly rulers. The problem with that interpretation is this is a divine council. This is a heavenly assembly. How does a human ruler who's judging unjustly, what does that have to do with a divine council? That doesn't make any sense. And elsewhere, the divine council is very clearly depicted as a heavenly council. And so, there's some difficulties there. But the traditional or standard reading here from that strict monotheistic perspective is that these are earthly judges. But it has to do with your presuppositions, right? Now, if your presupposition is that, the text could have errors in it, or the text does not necessarily reflect strict monotheism, you're then going to, when you see this, you're going to read divine council as a council of gods. When you see this, you're going to see it as one of the gods is fighting other gods, and now he's inheriting all their territory. And you're going to read it in light of contemporary Canaanite mythology. You're going to read it in light of that context, and you'll see the psalmist, you'll argue that the psalmist is importing that ideology into the biblical text. So there's a remnant of polytheism in the biblical text, but later on it was purified by scribes and by some of the biblical authors who opted for strict monotheism. So, right, so different presuppositions, you come to very different conclusions. So you're looking at the same data, but you're reading it in two different ways, right? Because of presuppositions. So that's what I think is pretty fascinating. Great Wall says, couldn't the unjust judgment be fallen angels like Job, where Satan goes before God? So my question is, if that's the interpretation, why is God assigning territory to demons to judge the earth? And why would he expect them to do anything other than judge unjustly? That just doesn't make sense. It's like, if God sets up a demon for a particular territory and tells them, hey, go out there and be a good, just judge over this territory, it sounds like God set himself up for failure. So, shouldn't you know that the demon's not going to do a good job in judging? It just seems like a preposterous conception, right? It doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So that's why I would say the divine counsel issue here, when it comes to a reference to and these judges being a reference to the angels, fallen or not, doesn't make a whole lot of sense either way, good or bad angels. If they're bad angels, why did God put them there? That makes no sense. If they're good angels, so now you have good angels judging unjustly. Sounds like they're not good angels anymore. That's weird. But that's also against the notion that the good angels could fall after the initial fall and rebellion with Satan and the fallen angels. So, yeah, I don't know the angel theory here. I don't see how that one really works. Okay, so Paul says that we fight against principalities, and God is going to take all the territories. New Testament says Satan is the ruler of the world at the time. Yeah, right. So, but is it God who's setting up Satan as the ruler, where he's expecting Satan to judge justly among the nations in different places, and then when Satan doesn't do so, he gets on to Satan? That's not what's going on there in Paul, right? So I don't think that really maps onto here, because God is indicting them for not judging justly. Like, he's expecting them to judge justly. So if this is a reference to Satan and the fallen angels, of course they're not going to judge justly. And why would you even put them in there to do that? So yeah, not arguing, but just trying to understand how we should interpret it. Fair enough. No, I totally get it. And I think that it's good that you're throwing these out, because it helps us have this conversation. I just don't think the angelic interpretation really works here. That's why most, again, within a strict monotheistic paradigm, are going to say these are human rulers. They're not going to say these are angels. They're going to say these are human rulers. But the odd thing is, it's talking about a divine assembly, a divine council, and it is referring to them as Elohim. And so there are some difficulties there with that paradigm, with that interpretation. Okay, so I thought this would be pretty fascinating to explore with y'all. I hope y'all enjoy this. What if this psalm is a glimpse pre-fall or something like that? So the idea here is that this would be prior to the fall, but these are judges. Whatever they are judges of the earth. Like, humans are already there and they're judging the earth. The problem is the fall happened before humans. The fall happened before Adam and Eve. So it wouldn't be pre-fall, because there would be nobody for them to judge. There wouldn't be humans there, unless you're saying they're humans before Adam. It just doesn't make sense. It seems like that interpretation is forcing the passage so hard that it ends up, overflowing into other problems. It's like trying to stuff a suitcase, like, luggage case. You're trying to stuff the suitcase with so many clothes, and it's spilling out on both sides, and you finally get like one of the sides fixed in. You get all the clothes fixed on one side, but when you do that, it's going to spill out on the other side. And then when you go to fix that other side, you get it in there, then it spills out on the other side. That's what it kind of feels like, is that interpretation is forcing the text to where you end up with other problems that are equally as difficult with that interpretation, to where it just becomes nonsensical. So while I appreciate the attempt at interpretations here, I don't know how effective they are, but I do appreciate them. I keep them coming, because it helps us kind of think through the issues, and I love it. And again, really appreciate you doing it. He says, "Gotcha. I'll have to dig into the psalm and see what's the general consensus." The general consensus, again, amongst Jews and Christians, would be these are human judges. But usually, probably outside of that perspective, it would probably be that these are other gods from Canaanite mythology, because you're clearly seeing Canaanite parallels, as I just showed you, and that was just one example among many. Clearly, there are Canaanite parallels, and they predate this, and they would argue that the psalmist is importing that ideology into the text here. So that would likely be the consensus outside of, um, you know, um, a Jewish or Christian interpretation. Although curiously, again, Mark Smith is a Catholic, and he does hold to the view that this is a holdover from polytheism, and that the biblical text later on adopts a strict monotheistic perspective, but the biblical text in other passages held to a polytheistic and henotheistic paradigm. So I can't say all Jews and all Christians. There would be some exceptions here, I'm sure. Okay. Joe says it would be pretty safe to say that a strictly monotheistic writer wouldn't put the psalm into the text. Well, that's a good point. That's actually what Mark Smith was talking about, however. And he was saying he argues one of the reasons why that's the case is that you could read this in a monotheistic way. And so some of perhaps the later redactors would not have taken it out. Whereas he opines that other texts would have been a little bit more direct and may have been edited by later redactors. But yeah, he does talk about that here, and he does mention why he thinks this one, in his estimation, slips through the cracks. Okay. Shalom says, is there a theological problem for us that the Bible writers are polytheistic? Well, there's different views on inerrancy and the inspiration of the Bible. There's a lot of different views there, right? And so some people hold to inerrancy. They hold to every word of the Bible is inerrant. There's others who say, no, only those passages that pertain to matters of salvation, like that are necessary for your salvation, only those things are without error, and everything else could be full of error. And then there's others who just say, none of it is full of error. I don't know how they make sense of that and still claim to be either Jews or Christians, but there's all sorts of people out there, right? But I guess with that, maybe that other position there, the one that says there's errors in the Bible, but not for things pertaining to salvation, I guess they might try to argue that this psalm isn't like necessary for our salvation kind of thing, and so maybe they did assume polytheism or something like that. I don't know. There could be a difficulty with that, because I certainly think that if the Bible is positing a polytheistic paradigm, how does that not impact one's salvation? Because if they then adopted that paradigm, they're adopting polytheism, and I certainly would think that would impact a person's salvation, right? So it seems like that is a matter of salvation. So there's some challenges there as well. Okay. So Irene, could Daniel 10 have anything to do to explain the idea that rulers judging their own area are princes? That's how some will read it in light of some of these other later passages from Daniel, and they might read this as human rulers, right? Um, so you might borrow from there or a few other places to say these are human rulers. But as I've already mentioned about probably, I don't know, 10 times at this point, the difficulty with that interpretation is verse 1 is God has taken his place in the divine council. Um, unless you're going to say these human earthly rulers are in this divine council, I don't know how to make that make sense. And if you're saying they're among the divine council, that's just such an odd way to describe earthly rulers. And it's a very misleading way, I would say, because divine council is a Canaanite and other ancient Near Eastern reference for a divine assembly of gods in the heavens, not just human rulers, but actual gods. And so I would say that the text is being misleading at that point by even using that kind of language. Like, it seems irresponsible to use that kind of language. Why do that? You know what would it be like? I don't know, just thinking of a weird analogy here. It would be like, tell me if this is misleading. If I went around and told people I'm pro-choice, and in reality, I reject abortion, and I don't believe that anyone should have a right to abortion. Is it misleading to say I'm pro-choice? Very misleading. Yeah. Now, what if I say, well, but if you ask me about it, well, but by pro-choice, I mean, I'm for the favor of life. I'm choosing life. I'm pro-choice for life. It's like, okay, well, yeah, whatever. But that's not what most people understand the term to mean. Because in our context, pro-choice means you're pro-abortion. So it's so misleading to even use that language. Now, let's think of the parallel for Psalm 82 to use the language of divine counsel. That's contextually in that civilization, they understand this to be an assembly of gods. If you're going to say what just refers to earthly men, it's such a misleading way to speak of it. It's such an odd way to do it. Why even do that? Why even troll people like that? Why even lend the impression that you're affirming a divine assembly of gods if all you really mean is just a whole bunch of earthly rulers? It's just such a weird, and I would say even misleading way to depict it. So I think there are definitely some challenges here all around. But anyways, I find it to be a fascinating text, and there's many other texts like this in the Old Testament, and you'll only start to notice them if you're looking at Hebrew and if you're looking at ancient Near Eastern parallels. Then you'll start to see them. If you're not doing that, you can read the Bible 100 times in whatever translation you're using, and you'll miss it every time. You'll never see it. It'll never come up on your radar. Okay. And yeah, the John 10:34 quotes Psalm 82. Right. There's a discussion of that there, but that one doesn't still shed a whole light on who these judges are, because even in John 10:34, it still doesn't tell you who those judges are. So actually, I people could read John 10:34 in multiple ways with different perspectives, because it's still not clear who the judges are when he's speaking to the Pharisees there, which is why I did not go into the New Testament parallel here, because it doesn't appear to be material, because it doesn't add any additional light on what we're discussing here with the divine council and the nature of these judges, whether they're gods, angels, or men. All right. Gonna do some more of these. If you're enjoying them, if so, hit that like button, hit the subscribe button. Let me know in the comment section. See you soon.